On today's episode, Dan and Manny welcome Tracy Jose, assistant professor at Stella Maris College in Chennai, India, to talk all about the impact of American culture on a post-liberalization India. Welcome to the Nostalgia Test Podcast, the show where two longtime friends put their mainstream pop culture past to the ultimate test, the Nostalgia Test.
What's up, Dan? Here we are again. Another academic type of episode on this one. Not me going crazy watching movies.
No movies this time.
Well, we'll be talking about stuff, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
So this is when we get more knowledge, right?
Yeah, because we definitely need that knowledge. I think what's great about when we had on Georg from Vienna is we learned all about nostalgia, which kind of created much more of a foundation for our podcast. And kind of if we're talking about nostalgia, let's have an expert that comes on and talks all about nostalgia. And I like this because I'm ready to learn more. I'm ready to kind of open up this podcast this way so that, our audience has gotten the funny part already. Now it's time to get some knowledge. And I think this is a great one because I think the best part is we're getting guests from across the world. So it's not just the perspective that we have right in our backyard, but this is amazing. I mean, are you excited, Manny?
I'm always excited. This is where I ask a lot of questions and we slow down a little bit. So yeah. And it opens up my mind to something I didn't even think about. So I'm excited to see where this is going to go.
Absolutely. So why don't we introduce our guests? I mean, we have an amazing guest here. We've been talking back and forth on email. And when I got the pitch for this episode, I was just floored. Also, that our podcast reached all the way to India, which is so humbling as two podcasters that literally just do this in our, in a room in my 1-bedroom apartment in Manny's house there in Long Island, and that it's reaching people. So that's really amazing. So welcome, Tracy Jose, assistant professor at Stella Maris College there in Chennai, India. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Dan, Manny. So I'm really happy to be here. I'll just give a quick introduction to myself. I teach English at Stella Maris College. So I teach both undergrad and postgrad students. And my area of interest is film studies and popular culture and food writing. So I think the reason why I was so excited to talk about this is because, I have grown up in a very active period in India, which is I was born in 1991, and that is the point at which in India we really started having a lot of changes. So liberalization, meaning that, we kind of opened up our national market to foreign investors. And that also meant, as a consequence, that we had a lot of cultural imports as well. So as was common at the time, the US was at its at the top of its game. And I also should give a disclaimer before I start saying anything, which is that all of this is coming from a very specific perspective of a millennial, middle class, privileged person. I also have caste privilege and class privilege as well. So obviously my experiences don't really speak to, a very common Indian experience. I wouldn't say that, but it's something that if you grew up in an urban area in India, if you grew up in one of the metro cities, I think people might find it more, relatable. So whenever we talk about urban popular culture, it's something which is very, very limited to people who do understand English and who do speak English, which is a huge population again in India, thanks to our colonizers. So we have to kind of remember that, it's not a common Indian experience that I'm talking about, but it is something which is kind of limited to a certain percentage of the population. So I'm going to be focusing on, what happened after 1991. So we finally, our government, our economist at the time, who also became the prime minister later on, Dr. Manmohan Singh, it was something that he kind of began the process itself of liberalization. And, we got to see a lot of companies coming in. Before that, it was, we were just kind of decades old kind of a country after we got our independence in 1947. So this is the time at which we kind of started looking at, culture very differently as well. So after this colonial hangover, which we had, which kind of continues up to this day to a large extent, we started looking at American culture as something which was very aspirational, something which really, got us hooked. And it was also because of, I think, capitalism and consumerism also played a huge role in that, because we were also enamored by a lot of the things that we saw in comic books and magazines. I think in my pitch, I had also mentioned how, I grew up reading the Archie's comics, which I think it was rather age inappropriate at the time at which I was reading it. But we did get exposed to, it was constantly like a sensory overload whenever we came across American popular culture, because it was too many things, too many, cultural differences as well. So the whole idea of dating, it's not really something that existed in India. And when I read the Archie's comics, and they were, also the specific, because I think I come from a place of interest in food as well, Jughead and the milkshakes and hamburgers and all of those things. While we were reading it, so I grew up in Delhi, which is the capital city. And when I was reading it, I didn't really necessarily know what those things tasted like at that time. Now, of course, things have completely changed. But there was this yearning almost for another culture which is not yours, and you were so curious about it, and you were so interested in finding out about it. So that's really where where I'm coming from. That's the main area of interest for me for this podcast.
Wow. I mean, I have a question immediately, but Manny, do you have anything?
Oh, I'm sorry. I hit mute. I was just taking all that in. No, I'm blown away about just like, because you brought up, I know that India is like, there's a lot of class structure, right. Different. I have my wife is really into different cultures and different, tries to get the history and likes to let me know about things. And we've watched different movies and I didn't realize that in India, there's such drastic classism in certain different areas. So I was glad that you brought that up, because this is coming from what you were experienced. So I appreciated that. But it's great because not many people know how much classism affects Indian culture as well. Right. And when we watch Slumdog Millionaire, and we watch, there's a recent one that I watched that blew me away a little bit. And now I forget the name of the movie, but the guy was like a driver, and I didn't realize.
Is it The White Tiger?
I think it might be The White Tiger. And he's writing a letter to one of the ministers that's visiting and stuff. And yes. It was that movie actually explained classism more, in my opinion. Right. And how people are viewed, and how it's just okay because your family grew up here and it's hard to even move up and down. So I got very hooked on what you said when you said that. And I remembered my wife and I talking about it. So that was great. And then I'm just excited to hear about just what about America? Same thing with the last podcast that we did about in Austria. What about America? Everybody loved so much and wanted to be. We're I'm here, and I'm I love European culture. I love other cultures. So it's always the grass is greener. So
yeah, I'm curious too about the one thing you said about the food as well, and how you were looking at stuff, but you didn't have the reference of how it tasted. I'm curious about that first time possibly, because when you have maybe a thought about it, you're only seeing it in also a static image, possibly, especially a comic. So there's not much you can kind of pull from it. What was it the first time you kind of were able to create that reference point from an experience of having that flavor or tasting something?
Yeah, I think so. Soon after we started getting, these like access to comic books, and later on, I think it took it at least a half a decade or a decade or so before we really got into, more and more families started buying color televisions.
Wow.
So it was only after that we got exposed to television series from America. So until then, it was all, state broadcast. So we had like one channel, which was called Doordarshan, which is the state-sponsored, the government television channel, basically, which was available in multiple regional languages across India. So after I think it took a lot of time before we actually had fast food restaurants in India, which were, selling all these hamburgers and milkshakes, and lots of different stores which sold clothing that wasn't ours, Of course, we had a very British kind of, anglicized version of a specific section of the population, which was dressing in a very European way already. Like we had the pants and shirts and all of those things. But what we saw in the comic books just kind of blew our minds because we hadn't ever seen that kind of stuff. So when I first had my, my first milkshake or my hamburger, I felt like I kind of knew, I had an idea of what it would actually taste like because I had so many reference points by then, because I had seen it on, comic books. I had seen it in television series as well. So I kind of, it somehow felt familiar already, like you already knew that, okay, this is what it is going to be like. And even I think some of the memories that I have of watching cartoons as well, like Popeye, for example, like again, very American burgers, wimpy, always eating burgers. So that was like a constant thing. I think that is like the most American thing for us in India right now. Like when it comes to fast food as well,
Wow.
Those big cheeseburgers.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's pretty interesting. So it's almost like by seeing the image, there's a familiarity, and then it's like it kind of plays on the other senses. That's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go back to what Manny had said, It's not just the class difference in India which kind of determines how much, cultural currency and how much awareness of American or any other Western cultures you have. It's also about the caste differences, which is really one of the most important things in India. If you are from a lower caste, would not necessarily have the same kind of opportunities that a person like me would have. So that is also something that needs to be kind of remembered. It's not just the class differences. It's not just your monetary, how much income you have, but it's also the caste group that you kind of fall into. And of course, the location as well, where you are, in a rural area of India or whether it's an urban kind of a setting.
Does religion, did religion play a big role on who got to see what, or the influences? Like, did people try to like hide certain things because of like religion in India, or like that doesn't even play a role?
I think definitely not in the 90s, because I feel like to talk about India right now would be a challenge because a lot of things have changed. We do have a very, very extremely right-wing kind of a voice coming out right now. So I think things have definitely changed right now in terms of censorship on even the OTP platforms like Netflix, Prime, all of these platforms as well. But back then in the 90s, I don't think religion would have played as important a role, at least from my limited understanding of it. But most of the families in India do kind of, at least back then, the millennials would have been raised by parents who were quite conservative, quite orthodox. So there was definitely, a limit to how much of things we could watch. So, for example, Friends was banned in a lot of families because it talked about sex and sexuality so much. So, I mean, I have my reservations against the show. I do not like it. I'm not a big fan of it. But
You're not a big fan of Friends? Oh no! You said this on this podcast. Oh no! We got to watch it again. We were like, was this actually that good? Was this? But that's funny. What was your reservations about it?
I mean, I have my issues with Friends, but it's one of the most popular television shows ever in India. Like
Wow.
even now, even in 2022, it tops the charts on Netflix. People are constantly writing about it, talking about it. I even get, references to characters on Friends in my answer scripts at college. So that is just,
Wow.
I'm just amazed at how big an influence Friends has had on Indian youngsters. Like even the Gen Z kids in, India, they will at some point or the other, inevitably, they will end up watching Friends. So our parents were not very cool about it, I think, because it did talk about a lot of things that were like, oh my God, not at all, it didn't fit into the Indian context, the cultural context at all. But yeah, it definitely did open up our minds to the whole idea of like dating and all of those things.
So that, first of all, that's happening here as well. Friends is having like a resurgence, and my niece, who's like 20, was like obsessed with it like a year ago, and I was like, you're obsessed with Friends? Like, it's not that great. Like, to me, there's so much better writing in other shows that were in the 90s and late 90s, that why people were so obsessed with the show, I'm not really sure. And maybe it's because it was just so like basic and easy to like consume. It was like, okay, yeah. So like, I don't know.
Saying basic.
So that's interesting. My question was about like the wardrobe. So now when I think of India, I think of like, amazing colors, but everybody's like, wearing very long dresses. The men are wearing, covers. When you look at American TV shows and American comic books, like it's a whole other dress. It's a whole other wardrobe. How did your parents okay that? Like, you guys all just started wearing jean jackets and like studs and stuff, like, and people were okay with it? Was it like cool? And like, were the parents like, okay, I'll just deal with it? It was like a rebelling type of situation.
No, I think so. One of the things that we do kind of see is that anything that comes from the West, as long as people are talking in English, it's also something which is seen as educational, because you're learning English in the way in which the native English speakers are speaking. So that was also a huge factor in, why, even though parents had their issues with shows like these, they didn't exactly mind us watching it, because we were watching an English show at the end of the day. Like, the language was English. So a lot of us did actually learn how to speak a more colloquial, informal kind of a tongue because of our exposure to a lot of these shows, films, TV series, also reading comic books and all of those things. Because when the British kind of left India after we, gained our independence and all of those things, the kind of grammar structure that we had that was taught in schools was kind of frozen in time in a lot of ways. Yeah. So it didn't necessarily equip us with the kind of language that you will use when you move abroad or go abroad, whether it's for higher studies or for employment opportunities. So you obviously did need to kind of have an exposure to people who were actually living there and talking in English. So I feel like in a lot of ways, American culture did get a pass because it was aspirational at the end of the day. Because if you were from the middle class, if you were, changing a few habits here and there, it meant that you were kind of climbing up that social ladder as well. So it wasn't necessarily met with a lot of, critical eyes, but there would have been, of course, a lot of conservative people who would have said that, this means that Indian culture is on the decline whenever they see someone with, a denim jacket or a stud in their ear. So they would obviously say that. But I feel like for a lot of people, it was also means of kind of climbing up the social ladder gradually. Wow. So right now, of course, if you, kind of take a cross section of the population in India, you will see even without any class barriers, people who have adapted to a very European way of dressing. This is, of course, for men and women, it's going to be very different. Women do tend to dress on the more traditional side, but men have kind of almost entirely moved to a very European way of clothing, especially in the cities. And this is regardless of, your class status.
Wow.
But is there a reason why it's the men versus is it harder for a woman to do that in India, or is it yeah.
The men have more freedom, for them, it's completely cool to wear t-shirts and jeans and shorts and all of those things. But when it comes to women, a lot of people do kind of have issues in certain parts of the country. I think especially if you move to the rural areas, dressing modern is seen as kind of, something which reflects negatively on your character sometimes. So, yeah, I think it's definitely different for men and women.
Is there still a juggle going on with that? Even now of trying to be more progressive like that, are there women pushing that forward or trying to change that narrative, I guess? Or I
think in urban India, we have pretty much adapted to kind of mixing both cultures, depending on which location it is that you are working in right now. We immediately switch, you do code switching. We also have very cultural kind of other elements of switching as well. So you kind of, when you're at home or with your family, you dress a certain way maybe, and then you go out with your friends, or if you're at work or, a workplace hang, basically, you dress differently. So I think it depends on which people you are meeting, where you're going, all of those things as well. So I think in urban India, of course, there isn't that much of a problem. But if you move closer to the rural areas, the towns and villages, you might face more resistance. People might look at you differently. So I come from the southern part of India, and when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, I would come from the city and I would obviously be wearing the clothes that I was used to wearing, like jeans and shirts and things like that. But in towns and villages, it was a big no-no. It was just, initially seen as, oh my God, what is this kid wearing? So it was definitely kind of out there at the beginning, at least.
When you watched these shows and when you first started watching these shows from America, and you have a lot of the female characters also pushing themselves into their professional roles, right? They're professional women, they're independent women. They have not just jobs, or they're not just housewives or something. They have these careers that they're building as well, right? You have in How I Met Your Mother, you have Robin, who's an extremely independent character. Elaine, I mean, what's weird about Seinfeld too is you only have one character who got married, and then
one character,
and then go ahead, because my question is just what kind of impact did that have, to see that image of American women in these shows kind of working in these professional spaces and building these independent careers?
I think it did have a strong impact on us, because in Friends as well, again, hate going back to the same old show, but I think that is one of the...
Especially one you don't like.
That does. So one of the shows that, has had a very deep impact on people here. I think just seeing people with a kind of a dispensable income, they spend so much time at the coffee shop. I think they were constantly there. So for us, just seeing that people are just, chilling and having coffee, which was kind of an alien thought back then for us. And now that I know how expensive New York is, I'm just wondering, what the hell are these people doing?
We wonder the same thing. We wondered the same thing. What did they all do for a living? And everybody's like, what did Chandler do? Seriously, what did Chandler do? Nobody knows.
I don't think the Friends knew either.
No. And way Rachel had to work there to even have a coffee. So,
and she could afford the rent controlled flat or whatever. So that was right. It was always surprising to me.
Exactly.
But I think it definitely did have a very strong impact because women were able to see people who were clearly able to enjoy life, and they're all. Friends has a very young and mostly attractive cast. So they kind of, see people who are doing things very differently, who have relationships and who talk about their exes and talk about their sexuality. And it was a very different kind of a life that we got to see on our television screens. It didn't mean that, we were definitely going out there and trying all of these things out, but it did gradually bring about a change. Like we had Friends, which I think there was at least a 5 to 10 year delay between when it was aired in the US versus when it got finally aired in India.
Wow.
So I think there was a 5-year delay. So Friends in America, I think it came out in 1994. And it was first aired in 1999 in India.
Wow.
So I think by the time we saw the season finale, it was another, 2 years or 1.5 years or so delayed. So America saw it much earlier than we actually did.
Wow.
But it still had a very huge impact. Like a lot of the other shows that you mentioned, How I Met Your Mother, and even the cartoons like Powerpuff Girls, which was very different from what we grew up watching, the regional language cartoons that we started watching. A lot of them definitely showed working women in a very different sense. But I must say that in 1980s, when we only had that one channel, which was the state broadcast channel, we did have a lot of independent women who were, working in all fields. Like the defense, there were shows about women in the Navy, although it wasn't actually allowed for women to join the Navy back then. There were still shows which talked about that. So we did definitely have good examples of working women in Indian popular culture already. But I think what American popular culture did was to kind of tell us that there was a world beyond the working world as well, that, you had all this free time and you could socialize with people and have an active, happy kind of life as well.
Wow.
So
that's interesting. So have you ever been to New York? I'm curious.
No, I haven't been to America. Actually, I've traveled to other countries, but maybe some other time probably. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I watch New York, or when I watch Friends or How I Met Your Mother or Seinfeld, and I look at the New York that they created, I'm just like, that doesn't. There's no way that any of this, like, it doesn't look like New York. They're like standing in the middle of a street and everything, and it's really interesting to see that because I've lived there and now I live in LA. And it's just like, that's not how it is. But it's interesting to see the other impacts of it when, like, we don't have that type of, the privilege of being in or living in New York and the privilege of living in the United States. And then like how we take that for granted through our media when we're just like, kind of like, it just flies by us. So how much of an impact it has on someone else, even if the portrayal isn't correct, I mean, which doesn't really matter in the end, but the type of impact that whatever portrayal it is creating is quite interesting. Wow.
So you are into the culture of America, but you haven't been to America.
No, not yet.
Is there a reason? Is there a reason for that? Like,
no,
do you
not really.
I feel like you not want to meet
against America.
No. It's interesting because you're studying, like, or this is about like the cultural impact of America in India, and you've been to other countries, but you haven't been here. And I'm like, is it because like you don't want to be disappointed at all? Like, it's like, I'll just keep it what I watched on TV.
No, absolutely not. I think I have seen enough, on like other documentaries and I think on social media as well, enough about America to have a better, clearer understanding of what the place is actually like. I'm thankfully not dependent on Friends or any other kind of
No, I'm not saying you are.
No, so I think Friends definitely, I don't think that is what New York is like. I think for me, New York is a place which is incredibly crowded. The subways aren't particularly the cleanest. People are doing so many things that I hear about on Twitter, especially. I think social media has kind of opened up our eyes a little bit more. Yeah. So I definitely don't think that, what is represented on Friends is like a very clear picture of what a real person living in New York at the time would have gone through. They seem to live very easy lives, to be honest.
I mean, of course. I mean, it's a TV show, right? Like nobody wants to see.
Yeah.
Back then, even nobody wanted until now. Like everybody wants to see everybody on TikTok and like being real more. Like people want to see more real things now. But back then, it's like it's escapism, right? You were watching these people and you were like, oh, like in awe of them. When like even if you were from New York, you're like almost mad at them because you're like, there's just no way you could be doing all these things and still living here, but you still watched it and people were still addicted to it. Now,
Right.
like,
let me just say one thing too, like Manny, just for 1 second, like that, like even those shows have had so much influence on American culture, right? I mean, when you think of like Sex and the City and how that show influenced whole generations of women and how to as an
just dating,
empowering dating, and just also like fashion, friends groups. I mean, all of a sudden people are like, you're the Carrie, I'm the, what else's name? I totally forget. The Samantha. So there's an interesting
Dan, you know the names. You were pretending.
No, I know.
I got it. I know you know the names.
I've seen the movies. They're but like, I think it's interesting to hear that because it's like the levels of cultural impact things can have, even like if you're in the space as well. It's like very interesting.
I wanted to know like what came first. Like, so obviously there's a lot of in you said 91, there's an onslaught of like all this different culture coming from us. So you got comic books, you got TV shows, and did you get food? Like did you like, was McDonald's, Burger King, like was that all coming too? And like, what seemed to take over the zeitgeist of India first? Like, was it all at once and you just remember it being like a flood of American culture? Or was it like, oh, we all of a sudden started seeing McDonald's and then McDonald's commercials and like all that other stuff?
I think it took a few years before we got the first McDonald's in India. So it would probably have been either in Bombay or Delhi, not in all of the metro cities immediately. But I do think that it really kind of started with comic books. I'm not really sure how many people would agree with me when I say that for me, at least it started with comic books. And I think television was the most important thing because it reached to a huge audience. Even people who weren't interested in reading experiences that were very different from theirs would definitely sit and watch a television series that was, being discussed in school as well. So Friends was one of those. Seinfeld, Dr. House, all of these television shows.
I love Dr. House. That show was phenomenal. Me and Dan loved that show when that show came out. That show was great.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's pretty good. So it was definitely talked about, and it's also, a way of, I mean, I don't approve of it, but people do kind of think that, if you're watching a certain show, you're very cool in India. So, people watch Friends, but if you watched Seinfeld, you were definitely a little bit, different. So you appreciated humor that was very different. In Seinfeld, people aren't they're not nice, and they don't pretend to be nice as well. They're just horrible people.
I mean, that's the greatest part about the last season was like, they're basically just showing you how terrible these people were and like how we just thought it was such a great show. And, but you're right about like, if you could quote Seinfeld, it's like you're at a different level. Like if you know the lines and it's like, oh, you watch that show. And then like that becomes like at work by the water cooler and you're like joking around saying all the quotes. So like Friends is one thing. And I always joke around, like all Friends had was pivot. That's it. And, but when you went to Seinfeld, there was just so many one-liners and just so many skits that if you were that group, that was like, oh, you're the intellectual, like you're more into smart humor and like you remember like other things other than just like slapstick comedy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think I think it's also about the kind of cultural, like it gives you a social push, definitely, if you are into things that a lot of people aren't into. Like you immediately become part of the elite cultural group if you, see shows that weren't so popular but were noticed nonetheless. So I think Seinfeld definitely fell into that category. How I Met Your Mother, Big Bang Theory, all of these were like very popular shows in India. In spite of Big Bang Theory having like one of the most horrible representations of Indian characters.
Yeah.
I was just about to say. I was just
going to ask you, because all these shows too are like so white. Like they're just like the whitest shows. And then you have...
Yeah, they're painfully white and painfully terrible at representing Indian people as well. So for me, Simpsons and, Apu was like the absolute, was like the pinnacle of horrible representation of brown people. Because I think I kind of started rewatching Simpsons, the first few seasons I'm on right now. And there's this one scene in which Apu and his wife, I forgot the name, but they have invited Marge and Homer over to dinner, and he says the most absurd chant before having their dinner, like before they start. He says something about, it rhymes, but it mentions Gandhi for some reason, which to me is it's ridiculous. We don't mention Gandhi at our dinner table. We don't talk about him or remember him before having a meal. So it was, it's like next level stereotyped kind of representation of Indian people. And the Big Bang Theory, of course, Rajesh being the typical Indian nerd who couldn't even talk to women unless he had alcohol. So I think it's definitely changing. We do have, other series which show like a very good representation of what Indian people are like. But I think it's still limited to what the diaspora remembers of India and not of an actual Indian person or of a recent migrant's experience in America. Like, I think it's very limited in that sense.
So have you seen Never Have I Ever? The show?
Yeah, I have.
So do you feel like that was a good representation of like different generations in like kind of culminating, or like, I mean, obviously nothing's going to be perfect. Obviously, I'm like curious, like your perspective on that, and, you being, I mean, you've said so, I mean, can't wait to listen back on this episode. I mean, it is like full of like such amazing cultural like kernels of knowledge that you have. It's unbelievable. So, but I'm curious of your perspective on that show and like how Mindy Kaling kind of was able to approach that.
I think I kind of have a bone to pick with Mindy Kaling because again, her representation of India is very limited. I think she comes from a very, very, diasporic Indian American kind of a background, which is of course, an entirely different experience. I'm not taking away any of that, but I feel like when she does bring in cultural elements that are very specifically that she claims are Indian, I don't think they are truly Indian, to be honest. Like the way in which the cousin, I forgot the name, Kamala, I think her name is, Never Have I Ever. The way in which she talks, the accent is the most strange accent I've ever heard. It's ridiculous. Like you'll never be able to go to India and figure out where that accent is actually coming from because it's neither here nor there. It's not, someone who's adapting to a more American accent or someone who's kind of going back to their Indian accent. It's nowhere. So for me, people in the diaspora definitely do kind of push this narrative forward of what Indian looks like. But I feel like, again, I might have to face a lot of brickbats because of this, but I feel like they have, kind of had a very long gap from what Indian culture is like right now, how much it has evolved over the years. So I feel like there are a lot of very extreme statements that are sometimes made of, what an Indian family is like. For example, arranged marriages, I think that is the most common understanding of, what Indian relationships are like, that we all have arranged marriages. But that is simply not true anymore. Although there are a lot of factors that come into play, not all of us are getting married as per, our parents' wishes, and it's not all arranged relationships and marriages. So I think, as far as Indian representation on television in American popular culture goes, or whether it's films or television series, there's still a long way to go. Like Mindy Kaling is not necessarily the best Indian representative to speak about our experiences, to be honest. So
yeah,
that's my 2 cents about that.
no, I mean, what's funny is like I was thinking about also as you're talking, like in the Big Bang Theory, Rajesh's father is actually did a few episodes on Seinfeld, and his character on Seinfeld was he was, Jerry got him deported, but also his representation of who he is in a totally different country, but like still the way he, American television, specifically like these types of shows, treat anyone that's not white, and they kind of create caricatures out of them where like Jerry, George and Elaine are not, they're just kind of people that just kind of exist, and they get to exist outside of any sort of other things. They kind of are there. And then you have everyone else who becomes like caricatures of whatever they want to kind of input into them. So yeah,
I would say it's always an exaggeration at the top level when it's about a side character, especially people of color. Like American TV shows usually just go like, okay, we're going to go one and we're just going to multiply every stereotype you could think about. And they're just going to do that. And they're going to represent the whole culture when it's like, how big India is, like, how many different types of characters you could actually have.
Languages.
If you want. Yeah. And languages, cultures, religions, like there's so many different things that you would have to engulf to try to get everyone representative. And then it's like, again, like that's never have I ever. It's only one person's eyes. It's one person's experience. It's like you can't.
And it's also very upper caste perspective, actually. So never have I ever is very clearly, it's a Brahmin family. So again, this whole narrative of how India is predominantly a vegetarian country is also kind of pushed in multiple places by the Indian diaspora abroad. But that's simply not true. India is not, predominantly vegetarian or anything. We do eat all kinds of meat. So I think, again, people in the diaspora have a lot of power and authority over how this image of the Indian is kind of constructed on a very global level as well.
So speaking of that is, have you seen change from, okay, so that you guys got like this like influx of culture. Everybody wanted to kind of be American in a way. And now you're here. Have you seen some people pull back and like filter more and control more of what cultures are what part of the culture is being shown to you, or not shown, but I guess like, is there now a filter, do you feel? Like where in the 90s, maybe like they just went all out and now it's like, oh, hold on. Like we can't show this. This is not what we are now. Or do you think that there is no control anymore?
No, I think there is. I feel like it's a very complex kind of a situation to talk about, because right now, we are, like I mentioned, with the right-wing politics that we have right now, a lot of people are kind of moving back to a lot of conservative ideas. I'm a little bit wary of using words like progressive and liberal when it comes to the Indian context. So there is definitely a lot of pushback when it comes to a lot of the things, especially when it comes to romantic relationships. Like when we talk about, how it is shown in American culture, like the whole idea of dating and having partners and all of those things. I feel like in India, a lot of people are kind of, because of their political leanings, perhaps, they're kind of looking at what to pick and choose. And, America used to be the global center at one point in time. I don't think that is necessarily the case anymore. So a lot of those things that were just accepted as a way of climbing up the social ladder in the 90s, they are definitely being questioned now. And a lot of people are kind of going back to what, Indian culture would have been like if all of these changes wouldn't have happened in the 1990s. So there's a lot of, I think, it largely depends on where you're from, what kind of a cultural background you have, what religion you belong to. But there are going to be a lot of changes, and it's difficult to kind of pinpoint and say that, this is how it is right now. But as a whole, I feel like India is definitely, there are a lot of changes, especially with the younger generations. A lot of them are super into Korean popular culture. So the kind of, hold that American popular culture had initially, like in the 90s, it was kind of just, the unquestionable kind of, the top ranking kind of culture that was imported. But now that is definitely changing. Like more and more people are talking about Korean popular culture and various other cultures before they, even talk about an American television series. Like a lot of Indians are watching a lot of K-drama, a lot of K-movies.
Wow.
So that's definitely kind of interesting. It's interesting to see where it will go. It has just started. So yeah, I'm curious to find out how that will evolve over the years.
Wow.
Wow, because I was just about to ask you too, have you seen that India itself is becoming the culture, like making its own culture, like coming up with more like interesting TV shows, like more like better, I don't want to say better produced, but like, because I feel like, I mean, I studied Indian film when I was in college and I thought the productions were insane. But have you seen that there is a move like, okay, well, why can't we be the center? Why can't we be the trend setters, like with music, because now that everything became more accessible and, the language, you guys, I mean, India has how many official languages? Like you can.
Yeah, we have lots actually.
So I feel like
29 states and lots of languages.
Wow. So as I feel like it's like you guys are more inclusive than some places, I'm going to say it straight out. You're more inclusive than Americans are. Like you like, why wouldn't they make a push of like, no, we're going to start the popular culture. We're going to show what India is. We're going to come up with the comedy that everybody wants to look at, or the show or the drama or the action movie. Like, are there people that are pushing for that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think because of OTT platforms like Netflix and in India, it's Prime, Hotstar, all those things. I feel like a lot of people have started to definitely push content that is very unique and very Indian. So we do have, Indian superheroes also coming up, which are, of course, again, a lot of it is based on American superheroes like Marvel and DC and all those things, but also very Indian in their own ways. So you definitely do have a lot of people who are kind of creating a lot of shows and films that are very Indian. I think that is a thing that goes on parallelly. I don't think it necessarily has a lot to reflect on the American popular culture. But if you look at cable television, though, I feel like in 1980s, when Doordarshan, the state broadcast channel, was the only option, the 1980s period was very rich in the kind of television series that it created. I feel like in a lot of ways, we might have peaked very early back then in the 1980s. And then we had this huge onslaught of American culture coming in. But the shows that were produced back then they're incomparable to the ones that exist right now. They were absolutely wonderful, very progressive, very liberal in their ideas. And again, very equal in terms of religion and gender as well. So they talked about issues that aren't necessarily being talked about in a lot of television shows and films right now. But I think it's, too soon to tell what kind of an influence the OTT platforms will have on Indian popular culture, because we've had a lot of TV series like Sacred Games, for example. I'm not sure if any of you have watched it, but it was quite popular in India. With a pretty decent budget as well. But Bollywood, of course, it's an entirely different world of its own. They put in so much money and create these musicals that not necessarily everybody can relate to. And I don't think I would look to them for Indian representation either, because they're also very cautious about the kind of things they talked about. And most of them, again, come from a very privileged upper caste background. So again, whose stories are they telling at the end of the day? It's very, very limited.
Wow. I mean, we just come to the end. I feel like that's a great place to kind of put a period on this episode. Tracy, thank you so much. I feel like you really shed so much light on so many different things. And also the one thing that's really interesting to see how just like these things that sometimes we take for granted how much impact they have in other places, right? Like we might binge watch an entire series, but like really how much it took for one show to come to you. And also like when you're talking about that 5-year delay and everything, I mean, there's so much that we take for granted in that way, that I feel like understanding that really enriches kind of even the shows that we might not be that really into, but like to see kind of what cultures are, what media is able to do. Wow.
I feel like knowing that there was a 5-year delay, it's so crazy because during that time too, like there wasn't the internet, there wasn't the Instagram, right? So imagine getting spoilers. Like I could follow you right now, and let's say I'm watching Stranger Things, but back in the 90s, I saw it 4 years before you. So like, if you had Instagram or anything, like if the internet was what it was now, you would have been falling behind. You would have felt like, as you were saying, like, yeah, it feels like in India, like you're popular when you know what's going on. And if you're in the culture, you guys would have been so delayed. Like it would have been like, I don't know what they're talking about. Like, why is this guy on TikTok talking about, Kate Bush? And he's like, what is this? So like, it's crazy how like everything played a role. Even back then, like the internet wasn't that strong. You guys got everything delayed. Like now there wouldn't be a delay. There can't be. Like everybody's now kind of lined up. Yeah. So like now it's like, okay, now that everything's lined up, what is really popular? Like you're saying now, people are like, America's not the center anymore. Like now we got K-pop going on. Like everybody's trying to see like what's going on over here, and why like this culture is so like fun and loud, and not loud, like I guess loud by color wise and stuff, but I don't really know much about K-pop, also like one or two like things that I hear, but it's just crazy to see like what time travel does, like what then and now it would be, and like how different it would have been if you only got all of it now. I don't know. It's just, it's really interesting. And I'm glad that you brought, that to the table. And like, you made me even think about like some shows that we might've thought was amazing. And it's like the representation of your culture or just the Indian culture in all is just so hard to like grab that. Like, it's almost an insult just to put like one character and multiply it, by 10 of stereotypes. And like, I know that there's been comedians and stuff that have been trying to get it to be more inclusive, but it looks like the way you're saying, there's so much culture, there's so much religions, there's so many languages. You would need like a whole chat, like you need a whole streaming service based on like to get everybody's like or influence.
You just need someone that's like, there are people writing these stories, and you just got to highlight the people that are writing these other stories and providing the narratives, right? I mean, it happens here too. Like,
definitely. And also highlight a lot of different voices, because India has so much. Yeah. And very often it's just the top 1% that gets represented. And that's really sad, right? Yeah. We have so many different people from so many different backgrounds. And I'd love to see more representation in that sense as well.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'm like hoping, hopefully with the, as internet access gets better everywhere and more streaming service comes in, it becomes a lot less expensive for artists to be seen, because they could do stuff for lower budgets and try to put it out in a different places until like maybe one of the big places sees it and wants to buy it. But at least nowadays, like it's easier now to make your voice heard, and it's just going to get easier and easier, hopefully.
Wow. Well, Tracy, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to getting back to this episode, but I'm looking forward to releasing this. I think this is so great. We're so grateful that you came on, that you got up early and did this episode with us. We truthfully,
it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Can I ask one thing, Tracy? What's your favorite? Yeah, sure. What's your favorite TV show?
You read my mind, Manny. I was going to ask that question.
Oh, actually, I do like Seinfeld, but I think my favorite American show is Malcolm in the Middle.
Ah, all right. That was a good show. I like that show. Have you watched it recently?
Yeah, I'm watching it again with my husband. So he hasn't watched it. So it's a lot of fun to re-watch it with another person. So yeah.
Wow.
Do you think it's still like, so here at this podcast, what we do is we always put our nostalgia to the test. So we put our past to the test, like where we think we remember a show or song, a movie, and we're like, oh, it was so good. Like it's still got to be good. And we watch it and we're like, oh no, it wasn't good. Or, oh yeah, it was amazing. So are you still finding that you're like enjoying it and that it still stands the test of time?
Yeah, I think it definitely does stand the test of time. There are a few like lines that maybe I wish they would have written it differently because some of it can be a little bit racist, but Malcolm in the Middle otherwise is a very wholesome, really interesting kind of show because it shows a different class with a huge family. You know, the people are very, they come from a specific social background as well. Mm-hmm. So I find it really interesting. The writing is excellent. I feel like some of the other later sitcoms have kind of stolen bits and pieces of Malcolm in the Middle as well when I go back to those episodes as well. So yeah,
literally,
I think it definitely stands up to the test.
Oh, great. Literally the show The Middle. I mean, all they did was take out the Malcolm part and they just called it The Middle. And no, I thought it was a pretty good show. They pretty much did that. It was really funny. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So that's totally out of left field. I didn't expect that, but that's amazing. Well, Tracy, thank you so much. I mean, thank you for coming on, for sharing your knowledge, for teaching us a whole bunch. I mean, really, that's what I love about this. And we are, forever grateful. This is a great episode. Hopefully we can have you back on. I think it would be great to have you back on in some capacity if you're ever interested. But thank you so much.
This was so much fun. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And everybody, put your comments at the bottom. Please let us know what you think about this episode. What are your favorite, shows from the 90s and any experiences? If you have like similar experiences of like media shows, anything like really in kind of teaching you a little bit about culture or whatever, we'd love to hear about it. Follow us on Twitter at Nostalgia Test, on Instagram and TikTok at The Nostalgia Test, and let us know what you think. But again, thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to the Nostalgia Test podcast to know when new episodes drop. Don't forget to leave us 5 stars and a positive review so more people can find the podcast. Share your thoughts and memories on today's topic on our Twitter at Nostalgia Test and on Instagram at The Nostalgia Test. Tune in next time because you never know what pop culture will pop up on The Nostalgia Test.